Our conversation today is about what's governing, what needs regulating, which is a really interesting question. We've touched on a range of ways to tackle this question over the course of today, over the course of the workshops for the last couple of days as well. And it strikes me that when we've talked about governing, sometimes we've talked about how do we govern Web3 from the outside. So we had a session on law this morning, some really interesting questions about regulating DAOs, and then there've been questions about how we govern it from the inside. So how do DAOs themselves govern, or how do DAOs govern themselves? The question I want to throw to Julian, actually, to start, as someone who has a much wider purview over frontier technologies than just the Web3 space or the crypto space, how do you think about the regulation or the political control or policy control of frontier technologies? What are the first principles? What should we be looking to do first?
Thanks, Chris. And thank you for the generous introduction. I wish I had a broader purview. I've learned a great deal today about the problem of governance and in the Web3 space. And I think that there are actually lots of insights and implications for what we think we know about the governance or the regulation of new technologies generally, which is, certainly something I'm very interested in. I guess I think what sparks this. So what do we need to regulate in this space without going into the related question of who regulates it, but what do we need to regulate? I guess, thinking about what we know about frontier technologies, about new technologies, here we're talking about one which is very new, at a very immature stage, as we said earlier. So we're obviously still discovering a great deal about how it works, but the conversations today have reminded me of that classic line about frontier technologies, that every successful technology invents new kinds of accidents, and not just accidents, but as we know, new kinds of crime, new kinds of misbehaviour. So they're the things that you look for. They're the things that emerge as you see frontier technologies being picked up, being adapted. And here we're talking, of course, about really a general purpose technology that we're seeing appear in all kinds of domains. So of course we're starting to see the accidents, the crimes, the misbehaviour, and people who are both members of Web3 organisations, members of DAOs, and also people who are outside them, suffering grave losses as a result. That's where regulation arises.
Aaron, I'll bring you in here. The question is, have I actually set this up right? Is this, I think we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years imagining how we can regulate DAOs. Do they need limited liability protections? Should DeFi be under whatever is DeFi a managed investment scheme? But then, of course, now we've got FTX, right? And FTX clearly commits crimes. There's clear harm. There's 1 million potential victims of the FTX thing. Should we just be regulating? When we talk to government about this, should we be just urging them to do the things that are obvious? Potentially just, make sure that exchanges have good custody protection, or is this a step back, or should we be going from a first principles perspective?
I think what the FTX stuff has done is really crystallised.
I just want to talk about FTX the whole time, just to be clear.
Well, it's what people are thinking about right now. But it signifies one of the key issues in this space has been around the regulation of exchanges. Really all the discussion over the last kind of 2 or 3 years. Yes, there's been some other stuff in there as well, but the big thing has been about the regulation of exchanges and should we have a licensing regime, and if there's a licensing regime, well, what are the requirements to get a license, and once you've got one, what are your operational responsibilities and obligations and so on. And some of that discussion has been around custody, or it's been around capital requirements, or how do you prove that what you say is true. So I think that's the place where I think is going to be crystallized due to the FTX stuff. What the risk is that governments, legislatures, regulators want to kind of have it all figured out. And that's what we're seeing in the latest delay from the federal government here in Australia is we kind of don't know what to do. So let's do a token mapping exercise where we're going to figure out all the possible iterations of every single token. And you can do that in an afternoon, or you can do as the government's doing and try and do it over 6, 9, 12 months to buy yourself some time. I think by the time you get a perfect regime, the technology has moved on, the issues have moved on.
Caitlin, as a practitioner, I mean, why don't I give you the whole question, right? So what needs regulating? What would you say if you were given a place in Congress or in Parliament and we're told, let's go regulate Web3? What would you regulate and what would you prioritize?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when you
Well, it was actually written for me, what needs regulating?
Oh, great. So I would actually say at first that, there's got to be someone else who would be better at answering that question. But the reality is, as a practitioner of this space, you already have so much more indebted knowledge than anyone who is actually making legislation. And I think that's a huge part of the way that we frame the question of what ought to be regulated is how much information is actually accessible and how are we making decisions based on presumption and assumption of technologies that are still rapidly evolving. So as for specific components of the DeFi ecosystem or protocol ecosystems, I'm not really sure. And I don't know if I've heard a really compelling case yet. But I think one of the things that is most prudent, and I think this touches on your point about how we've had these conversations for a long time, and it's important to understand when we're looking at the co-emergence of new technologies, that they emerge in regimes of power, situated in social constructs. And when we focus on finding perfect solutions with a focus on the technology itself, we tend to misunderstand how these technologies are liable to change over time and actually influence existing ecosystems and regimes. And that is the point at which regulation, I think, is most valuable, because if we look at Web3 as this new thing that we don't have sort of public protections or public answers for, it's a very overwhelming question to try and address because we understand there's so much chaos and lack of definition for a lot of these anomalies. But what we need to remember is that there are existing regulatory regimes for like technologies, and that is the perspective that's most necessary to adopt without feeling like we have to have a reactive approach to this as a single thing, rather than something that is embedding within existing banking systems, existing social structures, and existing technology regimes, even if we like to think of it as purely revolutionary.
So I reckon that's, Dev, I might throw actually a response to you following that theme. You've studied how governments across Asia particularly have been regulating frontier technologies and sometimes positively and sometimes negatively or using frontier technologies dangerously. But I think in the crypto space, we have this terrible habit of only focusing on what the United States is doing or maybe what Europe is doing, and obviously in Australia, occasionally talking about what we're doing. How do you see different national regimes approach these questions?
Thanks, Chris. I'll maybe make 2 points, and one connected to the points that Caitlin and Julian mentioned as well, and then connect that back to sort of what the countries in Asia may be doing. And I think going to this question of what's governing, but also, as Julian said, this question of who's governing. And I think so much of what we've heard in the last few days about what's emerging with DAOs, with new kinds of systems, as Jason was talking about, almost a new science, is this question of how do we govern these new spaces, these new systems, when the governance systems and regimes that exist today are sort of coming from prior systems, which Web3 in a way is a response to, right? It's a response to the failings of institutions of the past. It's a response to maybe over-centralized governance models, over-centralized companies. So you have this dilemma of how is a system that itself is kind of broken to then regulate and find corrections in this new system that's supposed to itself be the solution. So you have this sort of dichotomy. But to go back and to sort of directly answer your question, I think one of the things that I've always experienced, so as a bit of a background, I spent a number of years in China studying sort of development of technology in China and the internet in China. And often you would have these discussions around the internet and freedom. And I think one of the quotes that always comes back to me, I think, was Bill Clinton when he visited Beijing in the early 2000s, and he said, you know, the internet, censorship is not possible on the internet. It's like nailing Jello to a wall. And I think over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen that's just very much not the case. And so similarly, I think with this discourse around within the blockchain space, also around decentralization, this is recognition that I think there are several countries, you know, China being one of them, I would say India as well, where the state definitely has a very, very strong vested interest in sort of keeping the power dynamics as they are and sort of not allowing certain sort of emerging new spaces, whether it's DAOs, whether it's, you know, network states, whether it's these new spaces that are growing. And so I think that sort of political tension is something that is coming to the fore right now already with the conversation around, you know, governing the large tech platforms. So, you know, we're seeing Facebook's, Google's, TikToks of this world now come under major scrutiny for all the problems and issues that have sort of come across, whether it's around disinformation or it's around privacy and data protection and things like that. So I think I see, in a way, I feel like governments are barely getting grip on what's going on in those, you know, in the sort of Web 2 space. So when you talk about Web 3, I feel like that disparity seems so large, and I think there's going to be a huge game of catch up to happen.
Alexia, you're a sociologist, so from your perspective, I think maybe an interesting question for you is not just, you know, what we should be regulating, but who should decide what we should be regulating, and how can we navigate that? You know, this is a very crypto literate audience. We've probably got some really good ideas about regulations that should be changed or not go anywhere near crypto or what have you. But we don't just get to decide by ourselves. Who decides and who should decide?
Absolutely. This is a question that comes to the point of power and control. And essentially, I really appreciate the point that you're making. A lot of the Web3 space and crypto itself has risen up as a critique of the existing broken system. So the principles that came up through that, of course, is the self-determination and sovereignty. So one of the ideas, the perhaps ideal type ideas, is that the people who are affected by the outcomes of the technology are the ones who decide. So that is essentially a much broader group of people. Often in crypto spaces and with DAOs, you kind of see that form of nodal governance. So we're talking about the community members voting and creating governance over their structures, so this sense of self-regulation. And of course, that goes effectively within a self-sustaining system, but every technology like a DAO has an impact beyond itself. And so it comes back to these larger points about is regulation for government structures or nation states? Are these technologies even subject to the jurisdiction of a nation state when they can function within and beyond them? So it's a real complex scenario where you would like to have at the table the people who are affected by it, the people who are excluded from it, and the political, social institutions that shape, for example, the risk or contain the risk that these organisations bring.
Julian, can I throw just a related, can I give you a thesis? There's a number of, following Alexia's observation, there's a number of pieces that have been published after the FTX hack that have suggested that government shouldn't care about this. Government shouldn't be trying to regulate in consumer protection or something like that, because the only people who are affected by the FTX hack are people who decided to get involved in cryptocurrency in the first place, and who cares about them? These are obviously hostile hostile people. But it's not a. I don't think it's a dumb point, because, you know, it's a bit of a buyer's beware. If the technology proves to be inherently a scam, then over time it will just disappear. What's wrong with that argument, or do you agree with it?
Well, I guess I can sort of see a few kind of sides to it. I think what's probably wrong with it is the misleading and deceptive.
Yeah, look, I'm not suggesting that, you know, let anybody on FTX have their money stolen.
Illegal anyway, and you know, the people involved are likely to end up in jail. But I mean, I guess from a regulator's point of view, there is this sort of real question, because if you regulate it, you actually are validating.
Yeah, you're endorsing it in some way. Yeah,
you're saying you're giving it a tick. You know, a bit like one of those Twitter ticks that we've had so much trouble with. But so what does that tick mean?
Well, we haven't had trouble. Elon has had trouble with it.
No trouble at all. So
$7 a month.
So that's problem number one. That's the first dilemma. The second one is the one that Alexia's already also pointed to, which is, can you regulate this anyway? So what is the point of establishing what might look like a regulatory framework if it turns out to be purely symbolic? So you've got to be confident that you're going to get the right, that you're not going in either of those directions if you are going to proceed. I think you probably end up thinking you should proceed, partly because we know this is actually just the beginning. Ellie said at the beginning that she hoped that we now had flushed out all of the bad actors in this space. I think that's an admirably optimistic statement. It may not be true, and so it wouldn't be surprising if governments wanted to be there before the next one or soon enough.
Please do.
Can I quickly jump in? Yeah, I mean, let's make this about FTX and SPF even more, shall we?
Yeah. Drive in. Let's talk about the Bahamas jail.
Yeah, I feel like so much talk has been focused on, of course, Sam and FTX and the motivations and the illegal things that they would have done. But I feel like if we zoom out to see, I think FTX and Sam particularly is a product of a larger system, not just the lack of regulations, but also a larger political economy, a larger sort of system of narratives and myths that, you know, govern our society in a way. So, you know, we like to put a person on a particular pedestal. We like to, you know, motivations of certain greed and wealth that I think drive a big part of crypto as well. And so I think it's almost like the regulations are just part of it. So, I mean, going back to about what's governing Web3, I feel like maybe here is a challenge to Web3 itself to sort of introspect and find ways where, you know, you can sort of discuss the basic values that, you know, underpin so much of the networks and underpin so much of our societies. Because if that's going to change, we almost need a larger, wider, like, societal shift in what we expect from people and our companies and our communities. And I think, like, regulations is almost too narrow there, because we'll just keep getting another SPF and another FTX in a few years' time.
Yeah, Caitlin,
Yeah, I'd also like to reflect on this. So the idea, I've also read some of these things that have come out, and the idea that, you know, regulators shouldn't be responsible, provides legitimacy to cryptocurrencies, and people who are opting in are people who know what they're up for, and if they don't, then they should have in advance. I think earlier this week, Elizabeth Warren in the United States sent a public letter to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, and I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, one of the leading European regulators penned a blog post called "Bitcoin is Now Dead" or something to that effect.
How original.
Yeah, and they've published the same blog post like every few weeks. But in both of these documents, and this is something that's been reiterated consistently over time, is the idea that it's not about the actual responsibility or liability that individuals are exposed to, which I think from a risk and regulation perspective is not a particularly strong argument. We protect consumers in lots and lots of different sectors and industries in both local and multinational environments all the time, regardless of the nature of that commerce. But it's this idea that cryptocurrencies are still not providing anything of value. That they're not really assets, they're not really productive commodities, that they fall into this weird place of capturing this fake value that hasn't been realized yet, and that we shouldn't protect them now just because they may be value-generating entities in the future. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, right, we have these technologies. They are embedded either within or alongside existing regimes, banking, commerce more broadly, regulation, et cetera. But at the same time, you also have regulators whose perspectives are still driven by a fundamental lack of knowledge And I say this as someone who worked in government prior to coming to Filecoin Foundation. And it is this overwhelming reflection, I think, of the sense that crypto is still predominantly scams, because for anyone who is seriously engaging in the space, we know that those things do exist, obviously. But we also know that to say that cryptocurrencies across the board aren't worth regulatory credence because they're not generating productive economic value, it's very misaligned with the actual intent and potential impact of this technology in the future, but also now.
Aaron, we've got a broader menu of choices, it strikes me. The regulation has goals, and let's say one of them is consumer protection. And we can achieve that goal through regulation, potentially, or we can achieve it in other ways. And in the crypto space, we've got a just wider menu. Smart contracts can provide, at least on some dimensions, some of the protections that we might have expected from prudential regulatory standards. Do you think in your interactions with policymakers, does that have that argument that I'm sure many people in this room share, does that have any resonance? Does the, we can put the regulation into code. Can we sell that story?
It absolutely has resonance with the legislators and policymakers that understand the technology. It has absolutely no resonance with people that don't get it. So, for instance, when we talk about the need for, an exchange to either have kind of capital requirements or custody requirements, that choice kind of makes sense to regulators that know what they're talking about, but don't for others. So that we're coming off a very, very low base, I think, of knowledge. Interestingly, in the US. And it's changing slowly, I think, in the US. We've got hearings in the Senate, hearings in the House on, centered around FTX, right? Prior to that, though, 35 separate bills in the US Congress dealing with some aspect of cryptocurrency, bipartisan bills that are being presented. What's I think missing from the discussion, though, is, well, what do we mean by regulation, right? So I think what we mean generally when we talk about we need to regulate in this space is that we need some sort of, beforehand regulation, the stuff to prevent bad stuff happening. Whereas the regulation that exists now already is ex post. And you've got exactly that playing out now with FTX. When a company goes bankrupt or insolvent, they can't pay their debts as and when they fall due, they enter into that bankruptcy process. That's set up in legislation. There are reams and reams of regulations about how that process works. It's kind of a natural evolutionary process for corporate law. This is not, the collapse is not happening because there was a lack of regulation. This collapse is happening exactly because regulation is playing out how it was intended to play out. In the criminal process, we don't quite know what the charges are about yet. I expect if it hasn't been released on Twitter yet, it will be released at kind of any moment when that indictment is unsealed. But whatever it's sort of about, that fraud is being picked up after the fact. That's how the criminal process works. It's not that there is no regulation. It's that the current regulation is operating as it's intended to operate. And the challenge is how much preemptive regulation do we want to put on the system? How much can that system bear? And how much is actually achievable?
Alexia, is that a satisfactory answer, that we can regulate, we are regulating post after the fact? Yeah.
I was actually just going to say, can I jump in?
Good.
So, thanks. What I'm thinking about with this question is really about how a lot of the crypto space anticipates the possible regulatory regimes. So that anticipation drives a business or entrepreneur to try to position themselves towards legitimacy in order to take first mover advantage. So I really think that the idea that there is some form of regulatory discussion that establishes before the fact allows the ecosystem itself to kind of set a few goalposts as to how they can get to market quickly, but also stay in the market once regulation changes.
Right, and that's sorry to cut in, but that's exactly why you've got Sam running around Congress a few months ago trying to set up a regulatory regime, right?
Yeah. So to me it's that kind of the anticipation towards legitimacy that drives businesses and entrepreneurs in this space to actually get in and move. So you want to determine what it is you want them to aim for and what that should look like, and then who's going to do it. So the conversation needs to start now.
Julian, the brief history of Australia, as I see it. I should stand up for this. The brief history of Australia, or the Australian regulatory state, is that regulation was designed as part of a negotiation between the corporate sector, regulators, and the union movement, for example. And that's where we got the Australian settlement from. I think that's a relatively uncontroversial statement. But what we're talking about here, and it makes sense that it would go that way, because it's much easier for the government to call a leading CEO and the head of the union movement, and they head down to the chairman's lounge, Qantas Club, and they just bat out the ideas and and they shake hands and legislation passes and everything's quite wonderful. That's sort of the industrial regulatory state that we had of the 20th century. We're talking about technologies that are driven, however, not from large central hierarchical organizations, but they come from below. Those economic structures come from below. How can we even regulate? How can we come to agreement about what good regulation looks like if you haven't just got a CEO, a union leader, and a government official calling each other on their mobiles?
Well, we do have humans involved in the design of the regulatory structures of the kinds of organisations we're talking about. So it's not as if there aren't people to.
But there aren't bosses. There aren't leaders.
No, there aren't. But what we're looking at is a dispersed, distributed, fragmented, economic sector that's not totally unheard of. I think what is emergent, I hope, or probably not there yet, but will be critical in this area is the civil society side of it, is the associationalism, which, another invention of the late 19th century, early 20th century, but one that was not a party to the Australian settlement or elsewhere, but I think can play a really sort of significant role in this area. So, where are the voices of users, consumers, citizens, ordinary members of the sorts of organisations that we're talking about? I think what we may well see over the next decade or so is the emergence of, forms of organisation, means by which those people find a voice, a collective voice, whether or not that's, easily dialectically opposed to something else or some other voice. I'm not sure, but I think that is going to be a really significant evolution. I think it's already started to some extent because of our experience with Web 2. So what we see here is going to build on that.
But Caitlin, with your government background, a couple of months ago we would have said, well, we do have a voice in Washington, DC, but now that voice is in a jail in the Bahamas. How can we as a Web3 community manage to do that sort of really on the ground practical negotiation if we are by design leaderless?
I think I have a complicated answer to this question.
Good.
Unfortunately, to bring in an American perspective, Sam Bankman-Fried was not, or fortunately, was not Web3's voice in Washington, D.C. He doesn't need to be, because there's already a barrage of lobbyists, political action committees, and other political mechanisms that are unique to the U.S. context, but do exist elsewhere as well, that are already there and work day in and day out to push for favorable innovation policy, which is what they call it. And it's why when you actually look in the US, one of the only sort of bipartisan pieces of legislation currently being authored happens in the cryptocurrency space. It's because there's so much active attention and so much money that flows through these political tools. But I think one thing that the Web3 community is going to struggle with in terms of asserting its values and its preferences, whether it be for regulation or even in terms of its own structures outside of government, is that there is not a cohesive whole for motivations, right? And there is in fact a pretty large political schism between, I would say, most practitioners in DeFi and other elements and movements of the decentralized tech space. It's been pointed out in lots of other articles, both academically and not, folks who prefer DWeb to Web3 and the reasons why, actual political actors who are using these technologies and have used peer-to-peer technologies for years to subvert state influence, or other things. But I also have a paper coming out, hopefully at the end of this year, in a journal called Data and Society that talks about sort of competing visions of why economic networks ought to be built in this way, and whether you find them fundamentally socially expansive or sort of monetarily extractive. And as long as we have sort of a lack of recognition and very poor terminology for describing these different sort of philosophical approaches to why decentralization matters, you're not going to have like a really strong organic community voice for what Web3 ought to look like at a social layer outside of individual projects.
That's really interesting. Alexia, how, in your study of how communities sort of coordinate, how do we coordinate around that message? How do we get something that we can bring as a cohesive story to policymakers? This is the hardest question I've given anybody.
Got it.
Except for the Australian history question.
So basically one of the ways that I understand how community functions is to talk about it as overlapping values rather than shared values. So the aspect of cohesion occurs when those values can overlap to such a point that they can actually achieve something. And so it becomes that the different parties involved have enough incentive to pursue a particular goal that in some way services that range of values that overlap. So it is not a perfect answer and it's not a perfect system. Communities are not like that. So they always have tensions within them. They always have divides, and those divides are actually formative to how they function. So it's that kind of grind in the middle that actually continues to push them along. So it's not negative that you have so much diversity and so many differences in them. That's actually the nature of how you get a formed system in a decentralized process, which is very abstract to answer it. But the point is that these overlapping values have to share enough of an agenda to work together to achieve something.
Dev, where in the world do you see this work? Where do you see, outside the United States, where do you see communities coming together?
I think one of the nice examples I like to look to is Taiwan. So there you have, I think we have examples of the digital government and Audrey Tang, who's the first digital minister. And there's a very active sort of tech activist community there. And they've been there for a number of years, and they're a very vibrant, sort of resourceful community. And I think there we've seen, I would say, two examples, one of which has been used specifically in governance and creating policies. So for instance, when they were debating whether they should allow Uber to exist legally within Taiwan and sort of the competing interests of sort of taxi drivers and how to manage that, they used a polling tool called poll.ai, where basically they were able to get a large community of people to come in to help shape questions. So before they even voted on whether should Uber be allowed to stay and under what conditions, it's like, what are the questions that I should even ask? And so that was very community driven, allowed to shape those questions and eventually like bring that to vote and then bring that into law. So I find that community, Taiwan, a bit exceptional in that context, like both in terms of the digital literacy, the sort of the general like pervasiveness of smartphone technologies and 4G and things like that. But I think that's a good example where you can actually have sort of community-focused engineers and people sort of thinking first and foremost of the interest of the community and then building tools. And that tool, of course, wasn't decentralized. and the process. But I think the general values were the same, which was to have community participation and to try to have, I think, as Julian was alluding to, sort of the users themselves of the technology participate. And I think in Web 2, the biggest thing we've seen now is everyone today and their grandma knows that like the apps that they use don't serve their interests anymore. And so to maybe capture on this moment the sort of trust deficit, and then to actually start, bringing in these kinds of tools to say kind of user participation.
It strikes me in this conversation, and I'll give Aaron the last word. Strikes me in this conversation, we started with the question of what needs regulating, but now we're talking about strategy, is how can we communicate what needs regulating? I'll ask you that question, Aaron. I recall that in the previous government, the only way you could communicate with them was to tell them that there would be X number of jobs in it if you did something. How should we be trying to communicate, not just with this government in Australia, but how should we be trying to communicate the virtues of interacting in a positive way with this technology?
Look, I think from my perspective, and I'm pleased you gave me the last word for a change, Chris.
Yeah, look, I thought I'd give it a go.
I think from my perspective, it's low-hanging fruit and talk the language of the government that you're speaking to. I think here in Australia, and I think the same is true for the US as well, by the way. I think the key issue is scams. And for a lot of the crypto and the Web3 community, that might be a conversation that seems to you to be 3 or 4 years old. But let me tell you, there are people every single day that are falling victim to 4, 5, 6, 7-figure scams in Australia, and the same is happening in the US. And so that's actually the easiest thing to solve. And a lot of that is not deep degen Web3 sort of stuff. Most of that is centralized crypto businesses that are domiciled and running businesses in particular jurisdictions. So I think that would resonate really strongly with both governments here and around the world, and pick a single issue rather than trying to do everything.
Thank you. Awesome. I'd like to thank Julian Thomas, Aaron Lane, Caitlin Beagle, Dev Lewis, and of course, Alexia Maddox.